Hello and welcome to the Brave Feminine Leadership interviews. I am your host, Melissa Hamilton. It is brilliant to have you here today. These conversations are such a joy to me, and I know from all of your feedback that they continue to inspire your own leadership journeys. It's a space to meet with incredible global leaders, and we then get to soak up their perspective and wisdom on all things life and leadership. Today I am joined by Rose Fass, introduced to me by the incredible Tammy Irwin. I'm so excited about our time together. Welcome, Rose.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So let me share your bio, Rose. So Rose Fass is the chairman and founder of Fassforward Consulting. And with over 40 years of leadership experience across tech and consumer industries, Rose has a rare gift for stepping into complex change, into the messy middle, and guiding organisations to clear strategic action and their desired outcomes. Her extraordinary skill has been described as a translator. She's the former Chief Transformation Officer at Xerox and joined the Gartner Group in 2000, where she founded the Centre for Business Transformation. Rose is a sought-after speaker and advisor and has featured in Fortune's Most Powerful Women of 2022, Entrepreneur's 100 Women of Influence, and Forbes' Top 10 Women Business Leaders in New York. She's also the author of some fabulous books, The Chocolate Conversation and The Leadership Conversation. And when Rose is not leading transformation, I understand, Rose, you're singing the blues and hanging out with your favourite artistic, quirky types.
Very much so. You need a change of pace.
Rose, for our audience who haven't had the pleasure of coming across you before, can I just ask you a simple question, but who are you as a human being?
I think I'm probably a deeply spiritual human being. I feel like a child of the universe, someone who is an old soul. Um, I have a natural compassion for people, um, making sure people get heard and acknowledged. Um, And so for me, if I had to say who I am as a person, I would say I'm a person who believes in being part of the change that always needs to take place in the world. In the conversations that we have with each other, in the ways in which we show up. And somebody asked me, of all your accomplishments, what are the things that matter most to you? And I think it's having made people who have been in my sphere of influence matter, that they felt like they mattered. Um, so I think that's probably who I am. I'm also the daughter of Italian immigrants. I grew up in East Utica, New York. My parents lived through the Depression. My father was a World War II Marine. My mother had to leave high school in the sophomore year so she could work in my grandfather's grocery store during the Depression. And they were amazing people. Um, and so sometimes I think of myself when people ask, I'm little Rose from East Utica, New York, um, the daughter and the middle child between two brothers,
Mhm.
and the daughter of two first generation Americans who had really been the translators for immigrant parents who came to this country through Ellis Island.
Amazing. You share some wonderful stories about your father, and his leadership style. And I think one of the first ones was about moving your house, your family home somewhere. It's a wonderful story. Rose, in the very front of the Leadership Conversation book, in the section where you have the dedication, there's a sort of quote or a line at the bottom of that where you talk about, the most important conversations are the ones that you have with yourself. As we now go into your journey through your life, I want to hear some of those wonderful conversations you've had with yourself, and perhaps what do you mean when you say that?
I think the hardest person to talk to be honest with, to express oneself is with oneself. I think it starts with us, right? And so very often throughout my journey, I've had to have that conversation with myself about what I needed to do next. I remember making a decision to go to university, and my father, I had originally wanted to go to Vassar and study literature. And my father said, you need to do something useful. And you need to be in an environment, it was an all-girls school at the time. You need to be in an environment that's like the world, and you're not going to be in a single-sex world. So I need you to figure something else out. So I had to have that conversation with myself. I didn't totally agree with him at the time, but I ended up in Boston at university, and it was probably a good move. And he wanted me to be in the School of Business because he figured, I had to make my way in life. I will tell you why. At 10 years of age, I had a godmother who was positively gorgeous. She was pretty like you. She had dark hair, gorgeous eyes, tall, model, amazing woman. And her husband owned a bar and grill, and he never seemed to be around. And I used to say to my dad, gee, Aunt Augie goes to all of the dances and everything all by herself. And uh, I said, I don't feel like she's very happy. And he said to me, that's why you have to work. You have to make a way for yourself. Not everyone's going to be like I am with your mother. I want you to make your own way. And I want you always to have the freedom to walk away if it isn't right for you. That was at 10 years of age. And I came to grips with that later in life when I began to realize when you choose a partner in life, and I fortunately chose the right one, but I see so many women that are stuck.
Yes.
And that's the conversation they don't know how to have with themselves. Like, can I do this? Can I leave this bad situation and move into something else? I've had lots of those conversations throughout my career.
So, extraordinary entrepreneurial skills from a very young age. We mentioned just before I press record, I love the story about your hot chocolate on a golf course.
My brothers were born with extraordinary athletic ability. I was not.
Mhm.
I could sing and dance, and I could talk my way in and out of anything, but I couldn't do any of the athletics. So we moved to this home, as I share in the book, across the street from a golf course. And in the winter, everybody would go sledding and skiing. And my mom's got me all dressed up in this snowsuit and I'm like, I'd rather be anywhere but here. But at any rate, I went out and I noticed that mothers were coming to the gates with hot chocolate and hot drinks so the kids wouldn't freeze. So I came home and I said to my dad, I think if I could sell hot chocolate, then that would at least give me something to do because I can't ski and I don't like being on the sleds. My brothers were roughhousing all the time. So dad went in and got my red wagon, took the wheels off and made it into a little sled. And then my mom gave me the big coffee thing that she used to use to keep the coffee hot when she would have company, that big, huge deal.
Yeah.
And it was, you didn't have to plug it in. And dad went out and went to the church and bought some of those from the church supplier, the little hot chocolate packets and little cups and stirs and all that good stuff. And so I was in business. And so he made this little ledger and put down all the expenses and everything. Then we made a little sign. And before I knew it, I mean, I was really rocking and rolling. I had all these kids coming up. Mothers were giving them money. They were so thrilled they didn't have to come back and bring the hot chocolate with them. And I made lots of friends and talked, and I just enjoyed it so much. And I remember my first weekend coming home with $20 and cents, and that was a lot of money in those days.
Yeah.
And I'm 76 years old, so you can imagine being 10. That's, 66 years ago. So there I was, and dad comes out and starts marking off, the expenditures. And I'm like, what are you doing? He said, well, this is the cost of doing business. And I ended up with $8 and something cents. And I was like, what happened to my $20? That was a very good learning lesson. And as you know, I stayed with that for a couple of years, and then the golf course got wind of it, and they opened up the golf stand that they used to have during the summer months, brought in some heaters and started doing hot dogs, and they were putting me out of business, and I was like not a happy camper. So I went home, threw myself on the foyer rug, and had a little tantrum. And my mother was so upset. She was like, "What happened?" And I told her everything. And she's being very kind and very caring. And my father came home and, "Get up." And I'm like, "I don't want these big people. They came in, get up." And so I got up, and he goes, "What are you going to do? You're going to cry about it? What can you do? You've got competition." So I had no idea. And we started brainstorming. And I started thinking about it. He says, "People still like you." And my little brother Frank, who was the sweetest thing, he could ski with no poles. It's just, but he was very sweet. My older brother was tall, dark, and push button windows and a little arrogant, but the younger one was very sweet. So he walked up to my father and he said, "People hate having to climb back up the hill again. Maybe I could take Rose's hot chocolates and bring them down with the skis." And so we had our first delivery service, and my brother
Amazing.
agreed to do it. And he'd carry his money belt, my money belt with him so he could get the money. Of course, he wanted a cut. And I wasn't thrilled about that, but it was worth giving him a quarter or so to do all this. So that's how I ended up sort of staying in business. And I became a bit of a nuisance. So the big guys came in, and you might say they acquired my little business. And so I had the customer friendly kind of way of doing things, and they needed that because they were just really very much,
Yeah.
pragmatic. And so everybody started coming around, and that's how I ended up inside with the heater, which wasn't so bad, and didn't have to wear that big bulky suit anymore.
Your first,
That was my first experience as an entrepreneur.
yeah, and your first M&A experience
Right.
as well. So yeah,
Yes.
all coming together. So I don't want to cut too many parts of your career out because they're fascinating, but I know there was a very important period with Mary Quant Cosmetics at the time.
Yes.
And you talk a lot about the impact of Jack Winters and some of, his, tell us about that period a little bit.
God rest his soul. He and his wife are both passed, and sometimes you sit back and think about what an amazing pe people they were. They were just amazing. And he was the best boss I ever had, truly, and an incredible mentor and a tough dude. I mean, his mother was a milliner, and she paid for everything to get him through school and all that, being a milliner on the Lower East Side selling hats. Jack started Mary Quant. He went out and bought the company, leased the company rights to move it into the US. And I was at Saks Fifth Avenue at the time on their training program to be a buyer. And I talked a lot about the two women that I met there, and you know that story. But I really loved the whole idea of cosmetics, and I wanted to break in. And the cosmetic buyer tried to help me get into Revlon and various places, but it was all run by men in those days. And men felt that women would have too much of a bias if they were in cosmetics. So I found out that this guy, Jack Winters, had started this Mary Quant line, and I got introduced via a woman who knew people in Revlon who knew he had been with Revlon. And I don't know, we just, when God has his hand on your back sometimes, it's just the way it was meant to be. We met, we hit it off immediately, and he gave me my first shot.
Mhm.
And it started out, as you know, Mary Quant was in drugstores and cosmetic departments like everything else. And Jack said, "We have to have a competitive edge. We have to have a differentiator." And he decided to sell makeup, just color, no treatment, no skincare stuff, as an accessory, which was a unique idea, so far ahead of its time. You've later been involved with MAC and Biba and a number of other companies since that time, but he was the originator. And so Mary Quant was the inventor of the miniskirt,
Mhm.
and they had a cosmetic line. And we sold it as an accessory in junior departments, in the boutiques and junior departments, in the department stores, and in other boutiques, little boutiques that were coming up at that time. And I started in Boston, worked my way through, and then eventually grew that business very significantly. And then he made me the national sales manager. And I grew it nationally, hired some people, one of which is still a friend of mine to this day, a gentleman who I've known since we were both in our early 20s. And it was just an amazing experience. I learned everything you could ever learn about being an entrepreneur and running a business from this man.
What made him the best boss?
Say this again.
What made him your best boss? If you think
Um,
he's had a
I
long
think,
career.
yeah, he was very tough and
Mm,
very challenging, but he was also extremely supportive and deeply honest. I remember telling one story in the book about how we were racing up the East Side Drive to get to the plane to go to California. And a woman was stranded on the side of the road, and he made the taxi stop and he got out and changed her tire. And I watched that. I watched him do that. And I said, "You were in such a hurry." And he said, "Well, when it's in your power to help someone, you help them."
mm,
They got back in the car, and the taxi cab said, "I had to run the meter." And he goes, "That's okay. It's okay that you had to run the meter." And then we drove and we got to the plane, and he never said anything more about it. He was just that kind of guy.
mm,
And then if he ever saw you being treated in any way but the way you should be treated, he'd step in and take care of business.
mm,
Um, I just loved him, and I would have gone through a wall for him. I mean, he was that kind of man. He said to me, I said, I think we need more resources, more people. At the time, we called them people. We didn't call them resources. We need more people. And he said, well, you don't hire a head of revenue. Let's get the revenue. Once we get the revenue, then we can hire. He taught me that when you're in a negotiation and every objection has been answered and everything has been said, the first one who talks loses. Because I overtalked sometimes. I didn't realize it. And he said, it's okay to have a pause. It's okay for silence.
That's my favorite thing I try to instill into
No,
people is
wonderful.
pause, pause.
Pause, just pause. And so I learned that.
Yeah.
And there are two times you can afford to be strong. When you got everything to lose and nothing to lose. And most of the time you're in both those positions. So I remember being in my first operations review at Xerox, big company, totally different. Jack was no longer my boss. He was running a different company at the time. And I was 29% of plan. And I was standing up a month in the job with these really difficult guys, and they were being really mean. And they were firing away at me. And what kind of talent does it take to be 29% of plan? And I remember Jack, two times you can afford to be strong when you've got nothing to lose and you got everything to lose. And I stood my ground, and I remembered my father, the Marine, who was very similar, and he and Jack were really close. And I said to those guys, well, if I were 290% of plan after a month being in the job, would you have attributed that to my expertise?
Mm.
It just silenced the room. And I went from there and I built back that business, and the rest, as they say, is history.
So you
But
joined, sorry, Rose.
I learned those things from him.
Amazing leader. Rose, I wanted to move to Xerox because you brought that up. You joined there as part of a sort of fast track management program. They were looking for 4 females.
Crazy. The people from Mary Quant came back to the US when we got the company to 10 million. That was in 1973. That was a lot of money in 1973 for what was a startup in the US. And they took it over and they kind of kicked Jack to the curb, and I was devastated over it. So we all, as you know in the book, we pulled a coup. We all resigned when they went back to London, and we moved with Zach to Jack with Biba. Unfortunately, we couldn't get the funding for Biba, so Jack decided that he was going to have to close it. And he went on to Teddy and the Roxbury Bear, and he built that thing up. But I got introduced at a church ecumenical thing to one of the officers of Xerox, and they were looking to hire women. And women in tech were not the case back then. Xerox was a technology back then, even though we were copiers, it was a technology back then. So he introduced me to Ron Mercer. I was getting married in 1977. And the morning of my wedding in my electric rollers at the Roger Sherman Inn in New Canaan, he came over and interviewed me, and he sent me over to meet with another guy later, and I joined Xerox. I interviewed with a very tough guy who was later one of the guys that was in that first ops review. And he became sort of my champion as the year went on, because he saw that I had a lot of resilience and I was willing to do whatever I needed to do. I went through a lot in the early years at Xerox. There wasn't tremendous receptivity on the part of people who had been there a while, both men and women. And they had put token women in every district, and they were all competing with one another. I didn't even realize that I ended up in the West District in Midtown, Manhattan, and this other woman wanted the job. And she was upset because she got sent to Long Island. And I wasn't aware. So after the ops review was over, I knew she was not happy, and she had spoken to the other women, and they were all started out as sales reps and went the regular route. So I picked up the phone and I called her. She was a little shocked, and she answered the phone, and I said, look, I know I'm the first one to go through the ops review, so I thought I would just let you know what questions were being asked. And she was so appreciative, and I broke through what could have been a very contentious relationship. And she thanked me, and then I called the other women, and then they all started calling me, and we were sharing the war stories. And it worked out very, very well. And as a result of that, we formed a little bit of a community. And instead of one another, I said, there's nothing these guys would like more than to see us all fall apart and say, we knew women couldn't do this. Why would we have taken women? And I said, we have to show them that we're different. And that one woman, Pat Hill, now Pat O'Grady, went on to have a brilliant career in banking and other things, brilliant career. Kathy Mullally passed away. Dee Dee Rosenthal passed away, but a lot of these women did wonderful things. There was an instance, which is a funny story worth telling, when I ended up in Uptown. And there was a gentleman, Mike Blumenkrantz, and he ran the whole legal district, and he was a big piece of stuff, wearing Gucci shoes, Italian suits, had his shoes up on the desk. His boss would bring him a Wall Street Journal and a cup of coffee every morning. He was 450% a plan. They adored him. So they brought me in as part of my fast track training and said, Mike, this is going to be your associate. No, not. So everybody's sitting there. And I'm like, what do I say? And the HR person is saying to him, well, you have to take Rose. She's an associate rep. She's on the fast track program. And he goes, I don't do trainee. Trainees do not go around with me to my law firms. It's not happening. So Ross Milhauser, Sal Pentesi, they're all there. They're all laughing and joking and yucking it up. And Dee Dee Rosenthal is standing next to me. She later was not a survivor of breast cancer, but this amazing woman. And she's like, why do you have to be like this? And she was running Avon, and she was trying to defend me. At any rate, the guy who ran commissions is now coming from the back of the office, walking up to Mike and giving him his commission stuff. And he goes, who's she? And Mike goes, somebody they think I'm going to train. Not happening. So he turns around to me, and he's using Xerox language, Melissa. And I apologize if you need to block this off the podcast, all okay.
I'm sure it'll be fun.
you like to see my automatic input device? And now all these guys are really yucking it up. One of them's got a Vietnam jacket on. My brother had been in Vietnam.
Mm.
So I looked at him and I got a little quiet. And he's smiling this terribly churlish smile at me. And I said, well, I might be interested, but I heard you shut down after one copy. At which point, the entire group just wiped out laughing. And Mike looked at me. Next thing I knew is his Gucci shoes came off the desk. He punched the phone on the desk because in those days we didn't have mobiles. Picks up the phone, calls the HR person, who happens to be a guy, by the way, and says, I changed my mind. I'll take Rose.
Amazing.
And the guy came running out and he goes, what changed? He goes, she's got moxie. And he was Jewish. And I understood what he meant by that. And I was married to a Jewish guy. And we became incredible friends. And he taught me so much. I learned everything I needed to learn. And he was definitely instrumental in my journey as I went up and became, a region president and then later a chief transformation officer. And the rest, as they say, is history.
There's so many instances. I love that you shared that story because, again, it shows something that stood out for me in the book was a conversation when you became the Chief Transformation Officer, where someone in the room sort of asked, and everyone's feeling a bit awkward, sort of asked, well, what does the Chief Transformation Officer do? Because no one had ever heard of that term. Can you remember the line you shared at that point?
I guess if you don't change, you're under arrest. And later, what was really, and they all laughed, but later I was in there, Anne Mulcahy, brilliant woman, was the CEO of Xerox and a wonderful, wonderful woman who brought a lot of women along with her. But she came upstairs. She had been downstairs in the conference rooms down there with all of those guys trying to re-engineer all the processes. And she came into my room and she said, it is ugly. She came into my office. It's ugly. Pat and I, who was the chief information officer, Pat Wellington, friends to this day, and she was a celebrity CIO. And at that time, Ann was chief of staff. They were sort of the sponsors of the program, but everybody was men, and they were all around trying to do time to market, integrated supply chain, market to collection. It was all around the table. And they were brilliant. But this poor guy, Vern Zelmer, who ran sales for Europe, felt like, I'm a liberal arts guy. I mean, I don't know what these guys know. And they took advantage. And the one guy that was the chief engineer just used his intellect as an absolute weapon.
Mm.
Up with it. I'm sitting there thinking, I came out of the field. And so he goes, who are you? And I gave him that poem, I'm nobody, and who are you? Are you nobody too? Then there's a pair of us. Don't tell they'd banish us, How public to be somebody, how dreary like a frog, to tell my name the lifelong day to some admiring bog.
Ah.
The man had 17 heads. Anne was dying. Pat started to laugh and she goes, love that poem. So they're all sitting there and he goes, oh, so that's a poem. I said, yeah, that's for the liberal arts guy. Because you know what? It's important in the world of customers to be well-rounded. They don't care how many patents you have. They just want to know why they didn't get the machine on time or why whatever brilliant guy in this room decided that instead of sending the 110 plug with the 220 plug in case they needed one or the other, they would make the sales rep decide, send the wrong one, and then spend $1.20 to send it back. That was a brilliant move. Who here picked that one? And Terracini's sitting there looking at me and he goes, okay, just stick a knife in my heart. I said, dollar wise, pound foolish, the whole thing that we used to say, pound wise, penny foolish. So Maurice was looking at me. I said, I'm just a person who came out of the field. I ran a region and everything that happens here is because some poor schnooky sales rep is on the street selling something so that all of you can get paid to sit here and carry on. So Anne wants me to help you carry on in a way that helps them carry on. That's why I'm here.
Mm.
So they all looked at me and I said, so why don't we just take a break? So Maurice came up to me and he said, look, I didn't mean anything by it. And I said, look, Maurice, God gifted you with an incredible mind. Now you can use that to enlighten others, or you can use it as a weapon. On the break, you can decide what you want
You
to do.
You have, and I want to move to fast forward, starting that and things like that. But Rose, I've just been reading a book, and with everything you're saying, it's almost like you're epitomizing what they're talking about in this book. It's by Dr. Alison Fregal, I think you say her name, and it's called Likeable Badass. And it talks about female leaders needing to find that balance of warmth and power. And every single, you're using humor in all of these situations to,
It helps. I used to say to women, if you act indignant when someone is supposedly sexually harassing you, the minute you do that, you lose your power. You
mm,
have to find a way to reduce them without completely destroying them. In the case of the guy with the copies, shut down after one copy, he just kind of wiggled out of the room and walked away. It was not good for him.
mm,
But for everybody else, they knew where they stood
mm,
and they weren't around anymore. And you have to do that. You have to be able to face into that. Maurice later wrote the MBA program for engineers and business students at MIT. I
mm,
mean, he was a guy. So he did use his intellect later to enlighten others. And I spent a lot of time with him. And he didn't want to work with anyone other than engineers. So the way he rationalized it, he said, Rose is a human engineer.
mm,
So that's why she's here, because she's a human engineer. She knows how human beings work. And I never forgot that. And I considered it a compliment and I took it the right way. But
mm,
for him, it's his way of being able to bring me in without feeling like he had somehow compromised what he believed. And I do think women today, there's some phenomenal women out there, fearless, fabulous women. And then there are those women that get very fragile. And when you get like that, you lose.
mm,
So most of the women I try to mentor is don't be fragile.
mm,
I spoke to a really talented woman today, and one of the gentlemen who had been terminated for all the right reasons, part of his responsibility was coming over to her and he set up a call and she took the call. She wanted to do the right thing. She was on, and he went about berating her and she felt terrible. She got off of there. She said it like destroyed my confidence. And I said, never ever let that define you. This is a bitter guy who was projecting, but he was hurting
yeah,
at the time. And I said, and the best way for you to have handled that in the future is to say, look, I can see you're hurting, and I would be too. And I may be in your position one day because none of us are infallible. It'll happen to every one of us. But I'm here for you. I'm sorry you feel the way you do because I genuinely care about you and I wish you the very best.
mm,
Take the high road.
yeah.
We show compassion like I did for that woman who asked me about my adopted son.
Yeah, so
Uh,
tell that story because I've read that.
uh, Ron and I had gotten married. It was a second marriage for my husband. We are now married 48 years in October. His former wife, 49 years, going on 50, and we're best friends with her and her husband.
Mm,
And we share four granddaughters together. So it's very nice. But we got married and he had two children. And I said, do you mind if we have one? And I tried and it just wasn't working. And they didn't have the fertility things that they have today. So we ended up adopting my son, Zach. And I got him when he was like 3 days old, and it was just amazing. And I adore him. He's 40 now and fabulous. I have a wonderful grandson and all kinds of great stuff. Um, but I went to work after my leave. I was given an adoption kind of thing, a month off. So I brought Zach in because everybody wanted to meet him. And this very sort of difficult woman, she was always difficult in the crowd. And everybody was cooing and cowing. Oh, and she goes to me, "Is that your adopted son?" And everybody's kind of looking at her like, "Why did you have to say it like that?" So I said, "Yes, it is." And she goes, "Well, there's nothing like having your own." And everybody just, it took the whole mood down, Melissa. It was kind of like this whole feeling of being shut down. I thank my mom for this. My mom always taught me to take the high road.
Mm.
She could pour over a cup of tea than most psychiatrists could do in their offices. And she's always used to say, love people out of it, love them out of it. So I was thinking about her at the time. And I said, you're right. I said, when my niece was born, first grandchild in the family, my little brother is my dearest friend, and I adore him. And I was holding her, and I thought, I will never experience this again. But here I am with my own son now, and you're right. There's nothing like having your own.
Beautiful.
Just diffuse the situation. She turned pale and just walked back to her office. And as you know, a couple of days later came in to apologize to me. And we sort of talked it out, and she was going through whatever she was going through. People always attack when there's something going on with them. That's why that conversation with yourself is so important.
Yes.
It's projection almost every time. And I wish I could tell you, Melissa, that I always take the high road. I don't always. There are times when I don't.
Mm.
Proud of myself when I do it. But when I can take the time to think it through, I recognize this is someone who's hurting.
It's another example of using the pause, right?
Yes,
Yeah, like, that first response comes up. It's like, how do you pause and then channel your mother
yes.
to take the high road in that situation? So I know there's a stop between Xerox and fast forward, but I want to hear about fast forward, and I want to hear about, because I'm sure that was a brave decision to go and start your own.
So scary that, my book, The Chocolate Conversation, speaks to what I went through. But, we had moved to Gartner. I moved to Gartner with Bill McDermott, who is at Xerox, who's now the CEO of ServiceNow. An amazing guy. To this day, he's maintained his truisms. Another wonderful boss that I had the opportunity to work with, and a real people person. But we got there, and there was a very young CEO who had bet the market cap of the company and took a loan without a floor for the market cap of the company. And when it didn't work
Mhm.
out, the capitalist came running and it all kind of dissolved. So the Center for Business Transformation, which I started in Xerox and brought over to Gartner, had to go because they were down to the nitty gritty. And the CFO asked if I wanted to be with her. She really loved my leadership style, my work, my experience, and wanted to know if I wanted to take over corporate services. And I said, I just can't do that. So I accepted the separation continuance, and I came out of Gartner. And I had met this engineer when I was there. He was a British engineer, very difficult guy. And we did not really get along. We were oil and water until I had done a particular working session that he kind of loved. And he said, I always had people in two categories, idiot and okay. And I had you in the idiot category, but now I think you're okay. So I found out that he had just had a baby and he was in uh, England, and they called him and terminated him on the phone. And it was kind of horrible. So my anthropologist friend and I, who'd come there from Xerox, I said to her, I'm going to give Gavin a call. She goes, Rose, he's difficult. I said, I know, but we're so uniquely different and there's something about him.
Mm.
So he has a lot of compassion. She goes, so I called him and he answered and I said, Gavin, I'm going to start a company. I'm seriously thinking of starting a company, and I'd like to talk to you about joining me. Really? Well, I'm kind of risk adverse. Do you think you could do this? And I said, yeah, I do think I can do it. I was an entrepreneur before I went into corporate. I know how to go out and make deals. I said, but I need your intellect
Mm.
and I need your ability to put a website together and do what, because he was Gartner.com. He was very good. Plus, he was tall, very good looking, wore glasses, had a great British accent. And I thought, as a woman, I'm not going to have the same credibility as I will if I walk in with him.
Absolutely.
So I had an interview before I made this decision with an ex-Xerox guy who had been in that first ops review when I was 29% of plant.
Hmm.
David, God rest his soul. And he was in a big consulting firm, Mercer. And I went up to interview. And I tell this story in the book. I came down and we had dinner at a restaurant in the lower part of the building. And I was thinking, do I really want to do this again? Do I want to work for someone else? Do I want to? So I walked out of there and I was a little disoriented and I'm lived in Manhattan quite a long time. So I was trying to figure out, I got to get down to Grand Central. And he goes, Rose, he goes, are you all right? Do you know where you're going? I said, yeah, I just got turned around. But I said, yes, I do know where I'm going. And it was in that moment that that metaphor hit me that I was going to start Fast Forward. I didn't know what the name would be at the time, but I had done some business with Estee Lauder while I was at Gartner, and they were acquiring Mac, and they were having a lot of problems because Mac was a good girl company and they were kind of a bad girl company. So Mac
Other way
was a
around.
bad.
Yeah.
And Mac was very quick to market. Lauder was not, and it was an old staid line, and Mac was very scrappy. So I knew that this gentleman, a Turkish gentleman that was running research, was having a tough time. So I thought he'll be my first port of call. So I went and met Gavin for lunch, and he said, I've got to go get my residency. My wife is American, but I'm not. And I'm going to keep my British citizenship, but I need to go to Texas and get my residency. I said, okay. So while you're doing that, I'm going to go see Lauder and see if I can set this thing up for our first deal. Really? I said, yeah. And I said, we'll live off our continuance and just put whatever we can in the bank, and then we'll go from there. And he said, okay. So I found a little crappy office above the post office in Pelham. You know that story.
Mhm.
And my husband helped me put it together. I was a wreck. I mean, I thought, I'm really nervous. I didn't have a name, and I started giving this really curmudgeon-y accountant names. I gave him Fast Lane, Fast Track, using my last name. Came back, taken. So I said to Ron, I've got to think about this. So we went out to East Hampton to spend a week with a friend, a weekend. And on the way, I stopped at Lauder and I met with Shahan. And I said, look, I know you're having a problem getting Mac integrated into Lauder. And I'm thinking there's another approach toward this. I'm thinking you need to kind of leave them alone for a little while. And I explained to him what I thought should happen. And I said, I can help you with this if you would like. He said, I would like.
Mhm.
So I laid out what we could do. At which point he said to me, well, how much would you want to do this? I said, well, I think we could take a retainer for $100,000.
Yeah.
Flew out of my mouth. Jack always said, when you say a number, just say the number. Don't look scared. Don't look nervous. So he said, can we do 100 Canadian? Our fiscal year changes at the end of July, and I can give you the extra because 100 Canadian was going to be 60,000 American, but he would give me the 40 in August. So I said, yeah, I can make that work. Shook his hand. So he said, will I get an invoice from Gartner now? And I said, well, I'm not with Gartner anymore. You left your job? And I said, I left the company. I'm still in this job. And he said, oh, I said, I brought the Center of Transformation to Gartner and now I've decided to bring it
Mm.
on my own. Oh. is that the name of your company? I said, no, we have a name, but it's going to be a surprise. So he, okay. And I said, and you're going to be the first one to know. And I said, but it's being taken care of right now and I can't divulge. Now, my husband was sitting in the parking lot, not a patient guy. And I thought, he then says to me, I'd like to buy you lunch so we can celebrate your new start. And I'm like, oh my God. So I walk over to Ron. I said, I just need to go get something from my car. He said, no problem. I'm over here. So I walk over to Ron and I go, I got the deal, but he wants to have lunch. He goes, do not worry. I will go to a diner. I will grab lunch. And when you come back, I'll be right here, waiting for you. And good for you. And I remember just tearing up in that moment, thinking to myself, here was my guy, he was there for me. And I really thought he was going to be irritated because he wanted to get out to the Hamptons. I still tear up when I talk about this.
Yeah.
Went and had lunch, and I came back, and we then got this office, and the rest of the story. I was, the elevator wasn't working and it was smelling, and I had to go on there and clean it, and my nails were breaking, and I'm laying the newspapers out, and there's Ann Mulcahy, CEO of Xerox, and Wall Street's darling. And I'm no longer riding around in limousines. I'm not working for Ann, who was very upset about me leaving.
Yeah.
A bookie joint, sitting in an elevator, feeling like Gertie Schmertz, pulling a dirty rug up. And so I just had a meltdown. I just kind of sat on the elevator floor and cried my eyes out. And it was getting very dark, and my husband was coming looking for me. And he had a key to the post office. So he opens up the door and he walks in and he sees me and he doesn't know whether I've been mugged or what's going on. And I'm not audible. He's like, what? And I'm pointing to the paper. And he was good at that kind of thing. And I'm like, oh, and he's looking and he goes, Ann, you're upset. And so he figured it all out. He goes, get up. Second time in my life. My dad told me to get up that time on the golf course,
Yeah.
and here was me. And he called up the guy that ran the building the next morning and made sure that the elevator had a carpet in it before my customer came and that it was working. And Gavin, we went upstairs, we had a little conference table and a whiteboard. And what I realized, Melissa, the gentleman from Mac came, the head of research, because 9/11 had happened. We were supposed to meet in the Estee Lauder offices. They were closed. So he's telling me he's coming to my office, and that's why I had to clean the elevator and all that. So he says to Gavin, meets him at the door, and he says to Gavin, well, I'll take the stairs. He wanted to be fit. And Gavin goes, you sure you don't want to take the elevator? So we go upstairs and we open the door. And I think in that moment, I threw some stuff on the whiteboard. I did a method that we still use today, which was a DNA sequence. And I wrote out why acquisitions don't work. And it's in the book, and I threw it up and I said, it goes from culture to customers. I said, they want your innovation. They want your quick to market. They want everything that you have to offer, but they don't like your culture. They don't like your talent. They don't like you. And he said, exactly. And I said, and by the way, you don't like them either. He said, you're right. I said, you don't like their culture, but you accepted their money. And he said, yes, I did. So I said, so we have to make this work and help you make this work. And we will do what we can. And then Gavin got up and just started riffing off of me. And we got the deal. And he walked in and he said, I definitely want them to come to Canada. I definitely want. And it all got started. And I realized in that moment, it's not the props, it's not your title, it's not the company you work for. It's your skills, your competencies, your emotional intelligence, your experience. And that was 24 years ago. And Gavin and I are still together today. We have 20 people. We have a magnificent office. We have contractors around the world and Fortune 100 companies that we work with and do this with.
Amazing. And If I turn that then to CEOs and senior leaders who are leading change, your area of expertise. And I think the thing that grabbed me first was the chocolate conversation, but maybe I get you just to start there. What's a chocolate conversation and why do leaders need to pay attention to them?
So, the story that I wrote in the book. I had at BU been invited to a BYO chocolate party, and I was never a big drinker. And so, all the booze parties and the BYOBs, for me, they weren't fun.
Mm.
And I was looking forward to this. People that I could feel comfortable with. And I brought my killer chocolate cake, thought I'd be the hit and star of this party. And I got there, and there were some serious chocolate snobs. There was a table laden with the most exquisite confections that I've ever seen. And I thought, whoa. So I kind of put my cake down and moseyed onto the background. And I was talking with this guy, and this one woman was going on about percentages of cacao. And he looked over at her and he said, you know, when I want chocolate, I could just grab a Snickers bar and I'd be just as happy. And she goes, oh, I would never waste calories on a Snickers. So she was so thin, Melissa, she could run around the shower twice before she got hit. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And this is the kind of woman that I don't like. But at any rate, years later, I was in an all-company meeting at Xerox, and Paula Lair was talking about this strategy. This is before Ann became, and I was the region president at the time. And everybody went back and interpreted what they thought they heard. And he got very upset because it was not the translation he was looking for. And I said to myself, we're having a chocolate conversation. I went back to that party. And it just stayed there for a while, Melissa. The chocolate conversation concept stayed there just for a while. Later, when we started Fast Forward, MasterCard brought us in to do something with their newly this new business they had started called Advisors. And they were going to take all of the data-rich content they had on customers and create a consulting arm. And they had invited consultants from KPMG and actually hired them. And then they had the bankers who were sort of the people who were the subject matter experts. They created a nomenclature that immediately caused a divide. They called the bankers business as usual, and they called firm the big business bid opportunity people. So you can imagine how bankers who were very successful felt about being business as usual, and these guys were the big bid guys. So I went in and met with the president. It was a woman from Gartner who had gone over to MasterCard in their research that brought us over. Actually introduced me to Gavin. So Gavin and I go in there, and I'm sitting with Henry, and I go, the first thing we got to do is change the names. Let's just call them what they are, consultants. And let's call these guys subject matter experts or practice leads. Oh, okay. So I said, and let's have an open working session. So we had the working session, and it got into my head. I thought, how many of you understand the strategy that Henry's put out? They said, well, they want to take the data from MasterCard and sell it to customers. We've never done that. We always gave it away for free. And there was a lot going on. So I said, please stop for a minute. If I say the word chocolate, what's the first thing that comes into your mind? And I got all these different answers. And I said, a simple concept like chocolate. And you say, I want it over strawberries. You say, I want ice cream. You say, I want cake. You wanted Holly Berry. I said, you're talking about your Labrador Retriever, your chocolate Labrador Retriever. I said, we have a worldview that we all knew what I meant when I said, what do you think of when you hear chocolate? and you gave me the New York nod. But
Mhm.
at the end of the day, we all came up with a different standard for what we wanted chocolate to be. How much more complex do you think it gets when we deal with a strategy?
Mhm.
And that's when I came up with the idea of worldviews, standards, and concerns as the layers underneath a chocolate conversation. So that the worldview was at the chocolate level, the standard was at the Labrador Retriever level, and the concern was, but I wanted chocolate covered strawberries, not your dog.
Mhm.
I said, a worldview is how we see the world. A standard is the bar we set for ourselves and others, and a concern is an unmet need. And once you understand that, you can start to unpack these chocolate conversations and stop talking past each other, women and men, CEOs and employees, and start having real conversations. Jamie Dimon's very good at it. JP Morgan Chase, the
Mhm.
CEO.
Mhm.
To explain to people why he wanted them to come back to work. He used some language. He was tough, but he said, look, how can you engage in learning from others if you never are in the same room with them? I mean, he was like, and it was really a good conversation. He unpacked their concerns. He started with the concern instead of his worldview. He then said, I got a standard for how we deal with that. And then he came in with a worldview. I want people in the office. May not have to be 5 days a week, but I want you in.
Mhm.
Stephen Jobs was great at it. He always looked at what do people need, even though they don't know it. I mean, do you think you needed 1,000 songs in your pocket? No. But
Mhm.
he knew the world needed a respite, entertainment. Sony should have done it. But he dealt with the concern, set a new standard, and reframed everyone's worldview. So when you take it upside down, you don't start with the lofty worldview, but you start with the concern, which is what I did when Anne asked me to come down and navigate and facilitate that group of guys. I started with the concern. I didn't even know it then, Melissa, that I would later write a book on this, or that I'd figure out the formula. But the concern was customers aren't getting what they need. And you're all thinking you're big pieces of stuff, but what good is that if we're not bringing to the customer what they need? So when I was able to do that, I reframed their worldview. And I began to realize, so years later, I wrote the book.
Mm. It's the thing in the book that you talk about should be the thing that keeps all CEOs awake, which is that whole question of relevance as well. Um,
Absolutely. Addicted to relevance. I had Stephen Jobs was addicted to relevance. You know, there's four considerations of business, and I've said this all along, but most of the time people are talking about Wall Street, profit, profit. We're hearing now in the new administration in the United States, what about Main Street? What's happening with people? Because you can keep profit going by cutting cost, but that's not growing your business.
mm,
You can't grow and scale a business if the business isn't relevant. And so the most important thing for a CEO to be focused on is relevance. That's what I told Gavin in our business. We got to be relevant. And I often tell these corporations now, Melissa, you have centers of excellence. They're not so excellent. And the business doesn't always feel the excellence that's coming out of them. In fact, it kind of makes you sound sort of snobby. And well, we've got this center of excellence, which is talent or finance or any of those things. And the business just wants you to understand them. Let's start calling them centers of relevance. Are we relevant to the business? If we
mm.
were as entrepreneurs, would they buy from us? Would we sell our center to them?
Last question I want to ask you about the book because I want people to read these. Like they are brilliant books and simple and full of stories like you've been sharing with us today, which is amazing. But there's one thing in there that well, there's so many things that stood out to me. Message discipline.
Yes. That truly was a Gavin-esque. Um, Gavin always felt like if you had message discipline and you did not keep veering off your message, people would begin to get it. And what I later realized is I said, you know what, Gavin, message discipline drives operational discipline. So it's the little things. Like I think I told that story about Computer Associates, now known as CA, coming into Verizon and wanting Verizon to partner with them on enterprise-wide systems change. Well, ERPs are very expensive, enterprise resource planning, and Computer Associates figured out a way to do it in a less expensive way, and they made kludge work. So if you had a kludgy system, billing system, you didn't have to do it all over. But he came in with 45 slides. He buried the lead, and Tammy looked at me. I was with Tammy at the time, and she said, "What do you think?" I said, "Well, I think it was slide 42." And I said, "You've got two big messages." And the guy looked at me. "We're an alternative to big and ugly, and we need you for our pitch candy." End of story. And the guy looked at me, and the room looked, and they all started clapping. And they're like, "So tell them why you want them to be your pitch candy. What can they do to help you navigate through customers and be an alternative to big and ugly?" And the conversation then took on a whole new stream. But I think today we are beating each other with PowerPoint slides. Remember GM when they had that big fallout with one of their big, they had to call the cars back and they had a bad part, and they blamed it on PowerPoint,
Yes.
buried in the slides. I predate PowerPoint. So when the Microsoft guys came in to teach us about PowerPoint, they said each slide should make a powerful point. That was the point of PowerPoint.
Wow.
It was not to put your Excel spreadsheet or your laptop on a slide
Yeah.
and talk corporate pig Latin. People speaking corporate pig Latin. Stop. Use Sesame Street simple language. Bill McDermott, and I got that from Barry Rand. Use simple language. Sesame Street simple. Your 7-year-old ought to be able to understand it, not corporate pig Latin. One powerful point per slide. And Gavin's got a great book coming out called Story Business, in which he shares how to do that.
Mm.
It's a great sequel to my books. Whoever's out there, it would be great for you to read it. But it avoids chocolate conversations when you keep it simple.
Mm. Absolutely. Rose, we could go on for a long time because genuinely, I'm so passionate about this area that you focus on. So I will encourage people, as I said, to go and read the books. The final question I ask everybody is, from your perspective, what does brave feminine leadership mean?
Say this again. What
What does
does,
brave feminine leadership mean?
I think it's first and foremost, be you. Figure out who you are, okay? Because leadership happens in the moment. It happens through the human interaction you have with others. It happens in the conversations that you have with others. So be brave enough to be vulnerable. Be brave enough to be able to let people see your muddy shoes and your brilliance, because we all bio in with both. And that vulnerability allows people to get close to you. When you're guarded, people go like this. And you don't want to be sappy, obviously, but vulnerable means I'm willing to show that I have flaws, as well as confidence, understanding, knowledge. So I look at female leadership as be feminine. Don't try to be a guy. Be feminine. Use that woman's intuition, that beautiful stuff that we have, that we think this way. The fact that we can take a lot. My husband always says women endure so much more than men do. We can handle a lot. Use all of that as part of your tool bag to be the kind of leader you want to be, and surround yourself with people that support you.
Rose,
Because a lot of,
incredible,
yeah,
yeah, incredible conversation. And something you said earlier has just resonated. I just want to end our conversation on it. I love when you said in those conversations with people where they might be being challenging or all sorts of things, that line where you said, love people out of it.
yeah, love them out. My mother, love them out of it. My mother always did that. No matter how mean-spirited someone would be, my mother would go up and give them a hug,
Mm.
take a curmudgeon and turn them around. And I think women have to use that to some extent. I think I've seen too many women try so hard to be one of the guys. They don't want that either.
Thank you for joining our conversation, Rose. It's been an absolute delight.
Thank you. And I appreciate you getting up so early for me.